For part 2 of this lecture, we're going to be talking about language and ASD and what it looks like. What we see briefly, I'm going to review this briefly, is what we see in ASD is that the component of language that's always impacted is pragmatics. Where we see a lot of differences is unconventional language features, which we'll talk about in a minute, the level of receptive and expressive language, and structural language differences. So whether or not semantics, morphosyntax, and phonology are impaired is going to really rely on whether or not there's a comorbid language impairment. Remember that a comorbid language impairment is a separate diagnosis. We cannot assume that because a child has a diagnosis of ASD, that they also have a language impairment. So the kind of pragmatic language deficits we see are really going to look different across individuals with ASD. And they're going to totally be dependent on the child's age and developmental level. We'll see some issues with non-literal language, and so their ability to understand and use figurative language like metaphors and irony and sarcasm. Not only do they have a hard time using this language, and so they very rarely do, they also have a hard time understanding language, this kind of language. We also see issues with contextual use. So their ability to understand and be flexible within a conversation with respect to making a request for someone, as opposed to just chatting with someone about a particular subject. And so they tend to have a hard time adapting and being flexible to the times in which we might use those different forms of language. And so what you might see is a child who makes a lot of requests in an attempt to initiate conversation. But in most situations, that's not the most appropriate way to initiate conversation. But the flexibility of changing that approach is really challenging. We see difficulty with prosody. And so you may hear that a child's speech production is rather mechanical or robotic. You may hear them, by contrast, sound exaggerated and kind of sing-songy. You may hear them use inappropriate volume, either too loud or not loud enough. They may also talk very rapidly, which might impede their fluency. And so that might make their speech difficult to understand. They may inappropriately use questions. So they may ask too many questions and use that as a way to initiate conversation, but questions that don't necessarily lead to an appropriate conversation. So what you may see is, I like to go to the movies. Who agrees with me? And so you may see an example like that doesn't really open the window or open the door to an appropriate conversation. It allows for the child to receive responses along the lines of, I agree with you. And then that's about it. So it doesn't really allow for robust conversation. We may see difficulties with communicative signals, so eye contact, facial expressions, their gestures, body posture or proximity. So their ability to understand personal space can be impacted in a way that either they allow for too much personal space, so that it's an awkward distance between communication partners, or too much personal space in which there's not enough distance between communication partners. And so when we think about gestures, we may see conventional gestures like using their hands to communicate, but we may also see more kind of emphatic use of gestures in which a child may beat on their desk or clap their hands to really highlight a point. And this kind of creates an awkward conversational moment. When we think about facial expressions, we see really some unnatural use of facial expressions. And so when they're told to smile, it looks a little forced. They seem to be slightly uncoordinated, and they're not really able to integrate facial expressions into normal conversation. So importantly, when we think about eye contact, the point here is not whether or not these children make eye contact. It's whether or not they ever make eye contact. So it's the extent to which they're able to be flexible. And whenever you think about your own eye contact with your peers, you're not making eye contact constantly with the person that you're talking with. In fact, if you do, that almost is a pragmatic deficit. It's not normal to make constant eye contact, but it's also not normal to never make eye contact. And so we have this this need to kind of modulate between what's normal and how much eye contact is appropriate. So for your second discussion question, I want you to think about these pragmatic language deficits. Have you ever seen these in a child? And if so, did the child have a diagnosis of ASD or something else? If you have never seen these features in a child, can you envision a situation in which a child experiences these kinds of language deficits, but does not have an ASD diagnosis? And you can expand on that in the discussion board. Finally, we're going to talk about unconventional language features. There's a lot of heterogeneity here. So we see a lot of variability, a lot of differences. We may see a child with ASD who never uses unconventional language, and we may see a child with ASD who uses substantial amounts of unconventional language. These may also change over time as the child gets older and as their verbal and nonverbal abilities develop. So some examples of unconventional language features include immediate echolalia. So echolalia is repeating back what another person said. And so if you say to the child, time to say goodbye, and the child doesn't say goodbye, but the child repeats back, time to say goodbye, that would be an example. Delayed echolalia, so not repeating back a phrase immediately, but repeating it back minutes or sometimes hours, sometimes even days later. There may be use of stereotyped words or phrases. So they may have a particular phrase that they repeat over and over again. So they may say something like, I'll tell you what, I really like to go to the movies. I'll tell you what, it's time for bed. I'll tell you what, I really liked dinner. And so most of those phrases are used repeatedly. Or you may see a child experience a verbal ritual in which they repeat a certain phrase within a certain context on a certain day. So if a child is experienced with a very hungry caterpillar, they may repeat, on Monday, he ate through 1 apple every Monday. You may also see idiosyncratic language. These are also called neologisms. In this example, you may see a child use a very unique word or phrase to describe something that has a normal standard term. So instead of saying tears, you may hear them say sad water. Instead of when was it made, you might hear when was it born. Instead of triangle, you may hear them use a made-up word like plin. You also may hear some pedantic speech. And so in these situations, their speech is very formal and is referred to as little professor speech, where they may use a phrase like residential district to refer to their neighborhood. So imagine hearing a 4 or 5-year-old saying that they live in a residential district as opposed to saying they live in a specific neighborhood. So for discussion question 3, I want you to think about whether or not unconventional language features warrant therapy. So if a child is using any of these non-conventional language features, do they receive therapy for that? If so, why? And what might therapy target? What might you do in a therapy session? And if you don't think that unconventional language features warrant therapy, why not? Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again.